Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for attending the first eSeminar in our series, Contemporary Debates on State Building and Peace Building. My name is Jeff Burt from the Center for Security Governance. I'll be handling the technical side of the event today. The main way you'll be able to interact with our panelists is through the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. Feel free to introduce yourself, discuss, and ask questions of the panelists. If you have any questions or experience any technical issues, please feel free to email me at this address, and we'll work together to sort it out. At this point, I'll pass the floor to the Center for Security Governance's Executive Director, Mark Cedra, to make some introductory remarks. Mark?
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for what actually is the fourth installment of the Center for Security Governance eSeminar program. My name is Mark Cedra, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Security Governance, or as we call it, the CSG. However, as Jeff said, this is the first of a special series of eSeminars that we are launching on the topic of contemporary debates on peace building and state building. We have received generous financial support for this series, which will run for 3 years, from Canada's International Development Research Centre. So let me take this opportunity to thank the IDRC for their support. We really appreciate it. We also have 2 superb institutional partners for this series, the Balsillie School of International Affairs, to which I'm also affiliated, and Wilfrid Laurier University, both of which are based in Waterloo, Canada. If you are not aware of the tremendous research and academic programs based at these 2 institutions, I encourage you to visit their websites or contact them directly. Now, I'd like to say a few words about my own organization, the CSG, or the Center for Security Governance, given that we're very young, having only been in operation for around 18 months. The Center for Security Governance is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank dedicated to the study of security and governance transitions in fragile, failed, and conflict-affected states. We are a registered charity based in Kitchener, Canada. The Center works to advance new ideas and approaches to peace building and state building, broaden the debate over security governance among academics, practitioners, and the public at large, and enhance the effectiveness of donor security and governance assistance in fragile, failed, and conflict-affected states. Now that I have that out of the way, let me also say a few words about why we selected the topic for today's event. In recent years, the concept of peace building has faced new pressures and challenges. The concept, which emerged at the end of the Cold War, is rooted to the central tenet of liberal peace theory, that rapid liberalization would create conditions for stable and lasting peace in countries emerging from civil conflict, and democratization and marketization were mutually reinforcing. Now, the great ambition of the peace-building model, which involved a series of liberal reforms in the political, security, and economic spheres, has unfortunately rarely been realized. In fact, it has had a very mixed record indeed. Recent Western interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, which have seen largely failed efforts to build states and consolidate peace, have been a turning point. Quite apart from building peace, the Western interventions in these countries have in many ways created new conflict drivers, as the emergence of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria attests. The tumultuous period of peace building over the last decade has spawned a vibrant critical academic discourse that has challenged the model to its very core. That discourse has gradually influenced the policy sphere, where practitioners and policymakers have begun to question the accepted truths of peace-building and state-building orthodoxy. The future of peace-building is now being discussed in numerous official and unofficial forums around the world, in the UN, in donor states, NGOs, and academic gatherings. This is a critical period of flux and transition for the peace-building field, and the outcome is unclear. We thought we would contribute to this important global debate with this eSeminar by asking 3 of the world's top scholars and critics of peace building to look to the future of the field and answer the rather provocative question, is peacebuilding dying? With that short explanation, let me now welcome our superb lineup of speakers. I think we are extremely fortunate to have secured such a distinguished group. I'm going to introduce them now before passing the floor to each of them for 15 minutes of remarks. At the end of their remarks, there will be a question period where all participants, all of you, will be able to ask questions and post comments on the chat board. Our first panelist, Dr. Paul Jackson. Paul is a professor of African politics in the International Development Department at the University of Birmingham. He is a political economist working predominantly on conflict and post-conflict reconstruction. A core area of interest for Paul is decentralization and governance, and it was his extensive experience in Sierra Leone immediately following the war that led him into the area of conflict analysis and security sector reform. So welcome, Paul. Our second panelist is Dr. Anna Jarstad. Anna Jarstad is an associate professor in the Department of Government at Uppsala University. Her research focuses on the nexus of democratization and peace building in war-torn societies, especially in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Cyprus, Kosovo, Macedonia, and South Africa. She specializes in particular in power sharing as a form of conflict management. Finally, Dr. Roger McGinty. Roger is a professor of peace and conflict studies at the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Unit and the Department of Politics at the University of Manchester. His research has been on peace processes, political violence, and local responses to international peace support interventions. He has conducted field research in Bosnia, Croatia, Georgia, Jordan, Kosovo, Lebanon, Sri Lanka, Uganda, and also the United States. All of these scholars are at the top of the field in the peace building area, and we're really, again, fortunate to have them. And let me thank them all for agreeing to participate. So with that, I think we'll pass the floor to our first panelist, Dr. Paul Jackson. Paul, take the floor.
Hi, hello everyone. Can you all hear me? I suppose I've got to wait for a chat now, haven't I? Yeah, as Mark said, my name's Paul Jackson. I've worked all over the place, really, primarily in Africa, but just because I'm a professor of African politics, I don't allow that to confine me to the African continent. Sierra Leone is probably what I'm best known for, but I've worked in Rwanda, in northern Uganda, quite a lot in Zimbabwe, which is where I did my original work and my PhD until I got thrown out by Robert Mugabe. And then in the last 3 or 4 years, I've been the international advisor to the Nepali Parliamentary Committee on the Rehabilitation of the Maoists in Nepal. So a country that I got involved with specifically because I didn't actually know anything at all about Nepal. And they could therefore guarantee that I had a certain level of neutrality, or at least impartiality, between the different groups of people. Mark sent us a list of questions that he wanted us to consider. And in keeping with the overarching aims of the seminar, they're nicely well defined with clear boundaries and all of that kind of thing. So, is peacebuilding dying? Well, I don't know. The first question we were set was, what are the main fault lines in the current academic and policy discourses on peacebuilding? And this is something that exercises me quite a lot here in Birmingham, because I'm a political scientist, but I sit in an international development department. And within Birmingham, we also have a separate politics department and an international studies department. So even within my own academic environment, even I don't actually have to leave the university to find some degree of conflict between how different people view different kinds of conflict. And really, that's really about the lenses that they use to look at specific conflicts. Maybe I can talk a little bit about that a little bit later. However, I think it's partly misleading to talk about fault lines. I view it partly as being fairly fractured, in that I don't necessarily think there's a lot of animosity between particular groups. It's just there's not an awful lot of crossover between some of the ways in which people conceptualize conflict and peace building. So, for example, I have a colleague here, Stefan Wolf, who writes a lot about consociationalism and peace agreements. And I work on peace agreements. I work in post-conflict environments. I have worked on constitutional settlements, and yet we very rarely ever sit down and talk to each other about it. I think there are. So, in a sense, what I'm getting at is this idea that they're not necessarily fault lines. It's just that we're not particularly good at locating what we're interested in terms of bigger academic environments. And I think if I think about the field where Mark and I originally met each other, which is security sector reform, we were both working on SSR, but still do some work on SSR. I think SSR is almost kind of willfully under-theorized. And that is really because a lot of the people who worked on SSR were not necessarily academics. My particular take on Sierra Leone is that the whole SSR thing related to Sierra Leone was a post hoc invention of what was invented on the ground. And this was really started out as a bottom-up set of agreements that then filtered back up into the world of academia. And the consequences of that are that an awful lot of people who got involved in SSR early on thought that they were doing theory when actually they were doing policy prescriptions and an awful lot of policy documents. And I think SSR hasn't until relatively recently managed to penetrate the level of academic discussion that really we as academics would talk about as being theory. And that's not a sort of deliberate thing, really. It's just a misunderstanding between different groups. I think then, if you talk about people who are inside peace building, there are a number of fissures. It would be a very nice thing if I could say that people who are involved in peace were actually always at war with each other, but of course we're not. I tend to find that fields that involve work in an awful lot of nasty places, usually on very nasty subjects, are full of terribly nice people. So we all get along pretty well. I don't think there's any sort of personal animosity, even if academically there's quite a lot of debate in the field. But I certainly think that there has been a change, and maybe I'll come back to this in a minute, between people who focus very much on kind of national programming, if you like, the sort of security sector reform type approach where you take a very holistic view of an entire country. Between those people and a recognition, which I'm very glad to see as someone who, as Mark said, started out working in decentralization in the 90s, a recognition that the local is important. And I think Roger's been particularly important in this recently in talking about the local turn. Which is allowed me to say an awful lot of things that I haven't said before. But also, I think it recognizes that an awful lot of the issues with state building and peace building in general are in relation to something that I'm sure we'll come across over and over again, and that is this one-size-fits-all approach. The idea that you can have one model that eventually will fit absolutely everywhere. And certainly in my experience in all the countries I've worked in, that has never ever been the case. Okay, so this brings me to the second question that Mark set us, which is where have liberal peace-building approaches succeeded and where have they failed? This is an interesting question because I struggled for ages to find somewhere where I thought had been a genuine success. That is not to say that there haven't been successes, but I would say that it's a real academic sitting on the fence, that it's very difficult to divide them into two camps of success and failure. I think there are some things that are successful in some places and some things that are unsuccessful in different places. I think the road to democracy, as Anna and others have pointed out, I think has been an extremely difficult one. And I think there are very few functioning democracies that I think are functioning in the way that they were originally designed to function when they were sitting on someone's desk in Washington or London. But I also do think that there have been some notable successes. So I think, for example, particular aspects of reform of particular institutions. So the reform of the police service in Sierra Leone, the growth of things like family support units that made domestic violence, for example, much more acceptable in terms of reporting requirements, all of those things. I think that can be viewed as a success because it did allow a particular group of the population to then feel much more comfortable about going to police stations and reporting crimes that were then reported as crimes and then investigated and so on and so forth. However, we're talking really about pockets of success rather than overarching success. And even in somewhere like Sierra Leone or Nepal that I know well, or even in Uganda, I would say that is the success down to liberal peace, or is it down to other factors that exist? I mean, certainly Uganda, I don't think you could describe Uganda as a shining beacon of liberal peace. You might actually explain it as a kind of benevolent, or sometimes more benevolent, sometimes less benevolent dictator, actually managing to get things done and creating a system that works. That at some levels, particularly at lower levels, has some elements of democracy. You could say almost the same about Rwanda, except it's much more centralized than Uganda. And that in turn brings me to the third question. This is a nice, easy question, so thanks for this, Mark. What impact have troubled interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya had on the peace-building field? It would take several hours, I think, to provide an answer on that particular subject area. My first and initial answer is that those specific interventions, with the military interventions, the nature of the interventions, rather swept away a lot of the other quite good work that was going on. So with the initial intervention in Iraq, I was still out in Sierra Leone, and what I saw there was a massive shift of funding and resources away from countries like Sierra Leone and immediately into Iraq, which is hardly surprising, really. But so in a very tangible way, it started to directly affect programming that was going on in other countries. So Africa became, I would say this is an Africanist, but Africa became much less important, and Iraq and then latterly Afghanistan became much more important. I think the second point to raise about those is that they were a particular set of interventions. I used to talk about Iraq as an exception, and then Iraq and Afghanistan as exceptions. But increasingly, exceptions are starting to become something of a rule, or at least they're a larger group than they were. And certainly, the kind of military-led, security sector reform and democracy at the end of a gun, I think, is quite a problematic. Well, it's a very problematic model. And the reason I refer to them as exceptions is it's difficult to imagine that happening on a widespread basis in most of the world. I think they still remain a very specific set of circumstances. And from my point of view, I think that's a good thing from the point of view of building peace. As we've seen in Iraq, years and years of presence in Iraq, then leaving and then collapse, and then the rise of ISIL or ISIS, whatever you want to call them. Clearly, there are serious issues there about underlying peace, not taking into account local conditions, democracy, all the rest of it. And I think that the third point to make about that is that whilst I'm clearly a critic of interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular, that doesn't mean to say that we can't learn from them. I think we have quite a lot to learn from the particular interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Unfortunately, I would say it's pretty much what not to do rather than what to do. And I think in this field, that to me is going to be one of the big legacies of the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Can existing approaches to peace building be reformed? That was the next nice, easily bounded question that Mark set. I think though that it does have an easy answer. I think yes, and it's being reformed all of the time. I was teaching this morning here at Birmingham, and I teach one session. I have one session to do the entire world of conflict to a bunch of undergraduate students who are doing development and an introduction to kind of international politics. And conflict is one session. So I have a morning to effectively destroy their nice, cozy views about the world. And actually, peace building is quite a big part of it. And I talk about this as being an integral part of the political structure of the world, and that the making and remaking of different societies. And I used an example that came immediately to mind when I looked at this question and the overarching question about, is peacebuilding dying? And it rather leads me to the answer that if it's dying, it's taking a hell of a long time to do it. I use an example of something called the Cyrus cylinder, which is in the British Museum in London, and it's inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform. Of course it is, and it dates from 539 BC, and it's a detailed account by Cyrus, King Cyrus or Emperor Cyrus, of his conquest of Babylon at that time. Now, what this is essentially a document. It's a peace agreement. So, for example, it talks about establishing peace. It abolishes forced labour. It details reparative building activities. It also asks for prayers for Cyrus, obviously. It makes specific reference to the Jewish population, and arrangements are made for them to go home because they were held as slaves in Babylon, which is where some of you may have heard of it. He also demonstrates his religious tolerance by recognizing local shrines and the protection of local religious temples and so on. He seems to have had no idea of forcing his new subjects into a single Persian identity, actually. And he had the wisdom to leave intact the functioning institutions of each kingdom that he conquered and incorporated into his empire. And you kind of read that and you think that happened in 539 BC. And then you think, well, actually, in some ways, not a lot has changed. And even when we're talking about things like the liberal peace, and a military action in somewhere like Iraq, you're talking about people invading a country, then turning it into a liberal state, the same that looks very similar to the state that invaded them in the first place. And you think, well, if Cyrus had learnt that in 539 BC, what we have is not necessarily the question about, is peacemaking likely to change, but why aren't we learning from the history of peace building? I think there are a couple of other questions to add to there. That the next question that I have from Mark is, have alternatives to liberal peace building emerged, and what are they? And I think one part of me wants to answer that by saying pretty much everywhere where we tried peace building has produced an alternative to liberal peace building. I think there are particular issues with liberal peace building in that within the academic literature, and I include myself in this, we tend to build it up as a straw man and then knock it down bit by bit and say, well, this isn't like that in the real world, is it? Kind of thing. And I think that we need to be very careful about that, because I'm not even sure that there is a commonly accepted model of liberal peace building in the sort of detail that people write within the academic literature. So there is a skeleton of what a liberal state looks like, but one of my students brought up this morning something that I've talked about myself in the past. So, well, we live in a liberal Europe, but every liberal state in Europe might have a certain set of commonalities, but they're certainly not all the same. So why would what particular model of even a European state would we expect somewhere like, I don't know, Chad to turn into? What might that actually look like? And if we can't actually agree on what a liberal state looks like for us, then, is this idea of a liberal state, is it useful? I actually prefer to think of it quite often as a set of assumptions underlying particular activities that have become acceptable. I think that there is, if you talk to people who are working in the field, quite often they're doing things that they view as very technical. They might be doing the same kinds of things they do in the office back in their governments, and they make the assumption, the underlying assumption, without ever actually stating it, that this is what is good for the country. So, we know what a Ministry of Defence looks like, and we're building one here in Freetown. And we know what a Ministry of Defence looks like because I work in one in London. There is kind of there's a kind of underlying sort of assumption that everyone wants the same kind of ministry, but no one's entirely sure about exactly what that might look like. And I think that we kind of need to wrestle with that a bit more. Have alternatives arisen? Well, yes, I think there are an awful lot of alternatives. Nearly every democratic system that was tried to be imposed from the outside has ended up looking like something different than what was originally envisaged. And certainly, I'm sure Roger will say something about this a bit later, but a lot of my own work in the field has been out in the countryside looking back at capital cities. So I work a lot in villages, I work a lot with chiefs and traditional and customary authorities, those sort of people. And the reality for most people in those areas, if you live on the border between Guinea and Sierra Leone, will you see the state? No. Will you get your justice from the state? Not really. Will you see a police officer? If you live in a village a long walk from the road, no, you won't. So actually, what kind of state do you live in? What kind of peace do you live under? And the answer is you live under a non-liberal peace. You live in a peace that is dominated by local elites, social hierarchies that existed. Not that that's bad or good. It's just that they exist. So a chief will have a certain number of powers. The head of the local secret society will be probably the most powerful person in the village. And things like justice that are dispensed by local chiefs have a different meaning to the sort of justice systems that we see being introduced under international reform programs or even human rights. So justice for a chief in Sierra Leone is much more about maintaining his power and maintaining the level of social hierarchy, particularly since he sits near the top of the social hierarchy. I think there are I think the danger in looking at non-liberal peace building is either just to write it off and say that it's not there and it's terrible and you can't do it, or to over-romanticize it and say that actually this is all wonderful. And as someone said to me once on an aeroplane, oh, this is terribly organic. And I wasn't entirely sure what he meant then, and I have to say I'm not entirely sure what he means now. I think that raises, I think, the last question, which is about what you think holds the future for the international peace building, and are we moving towards post-liberal peace? I think in a way we're already there. I'm not sure we ever really achieved a liberal peace. So I think maybe we were in a pre-liberal peace or in a failed liberal peace. I think that they are, related to a lot of things that are going on the ground about we have to be very, very aware about our own limitations if we intervene. So if I'm working for a donor, or if I'm sitting in Whitehall, as I often do, talking to Department for International Development people, we have to be very, very aware that actually, if we're really going to build a state, we have to say that we're going to, it's going to take a long time. I mean, here in the UK, we're talking about the foundation of the British state being in 1215 in the Magna Carta, because there's a big anniversary in a minute. 1215 is a long time ago. It's taken a long time to develop the institutions in the Northian sense, not institutions as in organizations, but institutions as in ways of doing things. And anything that involves changing the way that people do things takes an awful, awful long time. I think also there are big questions to raise about how far the international intervention technologies, if you like, are able and or willing politically to work alongside these non-liberal arrangements. My own personal view is that they have to learn how to do it, otherwise there isn't going to be any intervention, or at least any intervention that's going to have any impact at all, that's positive. Because I think that one of the big lessons we've learned is that we can't ignore any of these things. But I think there is a question about whether that leads then to some form of hybridity, or whether it leads to a system where we actually are faced, or people on the ground are faced with a situation where they choose between competing institutions. And the most effective way of intervening in that context is actually helping people and supporting them to navigate their way between different institutions and make choices that are beneficial to them rather than the institution. Okay, and I've spoken for more than 15 minutes, so I'm very sorry about that. As Mark will tell you, I can talk.
And I can confirm that that's actually a short presentation for Paul. Keeping it under an hour is usually a stretch. So thanks very much, Paul, and really appreciated your insightful remarks. It's always great to hear from you. I think gave us a lot of food for thought. I see that some questions are already coming in the chat. Please keep them coming. You can post your questions now, And then during the discussion period, we will present those to our panelists again for them to answer. So feel free to post your questions or comments at any time, as I know some of you have been doing already. I also just wanted to give a hello to a classroom that's taking part or monitoring today's discussion, Professor Tim Donay's class at Wilfrid Laurier University. So I just wanted to give a greeting to them, and to Tim, and thank you for taking part also in this discussion. So with that, I'm going to pass the floor now to Anna, who is going to give her remarks. Anna,
thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for the kind introduction in the beginning. I'm very happy to be online with all of you. Well, the main topic of this seminar is Peacebuilding dying? And I would say no, it's not dying. We can see that a lot of new international peacebuilding missions are launched all the time. So I don't think we will see an end to that. So I believe that the practice of international efforts to promote both democracy and peace is likely to continue, despite the harsh criticism against both the liberal peace theory in general and the critique of individual international operations. But to really understand what is going on and to try to avoid repeating much of the things that John said, I will try to take a step back and revisit both some previous research and policy recommendations, and analyze, and I think also we have to analyze the practice of peacebuilding missions. And to understand the underpinnings or theoretical underpinnings of the of the practice, of the current practice, I think is important. And Mark, you did introduce the democratic peace thesis, that democracies do not go to war with one another. And this has been used, this thesis has been used to justify military interventions by several politicians, including Margaret Thatcher, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. But it is a very big leap from the observation of a correlation between consolidated democracies and interstate peace to a policy that implies that democracy should be imposed from the outside. And I believe that the practice rests on very shaky theoretical foundations. Many people agree with that. And there are many problems with the democratic peace thesis. The proposed explanations to why democracy would cause peace are weak, and they don't hold up to empirical tests, as many of my colleagues who do more quantitative work have shown. Howard Hegre, for instance, he suggests that it may be the other way around. It's not democracy causing peace, but rather that peace causes democracy. And he also suggests and tests that there might be other factors that cause both peace and democracy. So I will not go into details of this research field, but I just want to say that the democratic peace thesis does not in itself prescribe the use of force to turn autocracies into democracies. But even if the liberal peace thesis is flawed or even wrong, I believe that liberal ideas, or whatever we want to call them, are very important for peace. And I believe that liberal ideas are not Western only. Even in conflict areas, there are people who want to have a greater say in their lives and believe that everyone should have the right to participate in politics. So I don't think it's fair to say that the idea of democracy is a Western concept. I don't think it would be fair to all those people that are working for democratization and peace in those countries. I know that there are people, even in the middle of conflict, that try to work for democratization and peace. Yeah, I think there are both individuals and local movements that work both for peace, justice, and democracy, as I said. And some of these are local initiatives, purely local initiatives, with no international support. And I don't think it's fair to them to say that democracy is a Western concept. And I don't. This means that I don't necessarily believe that supporting local initiatives, such local initiatives, necessarily is an act of imposing democracy. And also in a world that is where internet is available almost in all parts of the world, and the local and international is blurred, that means that it's difficult to know what is really local and what is foreign and what is outside and inside, what is a Western concept or not. But my point is just that the notion of democracy exists in many places outside of the Western world, and sometimes peace movements do not explicitly refer to democracy, but rather to values that we associate with democracy, such as inclusion, justice, participation. And I think this is important to keep in mind. So we shouldn't, when we criticize the liberal peace thesis or research on the liberal peace, we have to be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, because I think there is many people want some form of democracy. But the belief that democracy can provide a safer and better world for all of us is so strong, I think, that there is a risk that we sometimes turn a blind eye to the fact that the road to democracy is very dangerous and may even lead to violent conflict. And there are plenty of research that describe the dangers of democratization and international interventions. But this has not meant that international operations have ended. And to just end all forms of democracy promotion and end all peace missions is not an option. It just isn't. I think the international community just thinks that, well, it has to work somehow. We don't know exactly how. Well, but how does it work then in practice? Well, despite a lot of research on the challenges and the dilemmas that arise when peace building and democratizations are pursued at the same time, contemporary missions still try to achieve both goals simultaneously. So we can see that efforts to promote democratization sometimes have a negative effect on peace, and vice versa, that efforts to promote peace sometimes can hinder democratization. But internationals and practitioners, they muddle through most of the time. And many practitioners in the field, they are aware that there are trade-offs and that they sometimes have to choose between securing the peace or promoting democracy. Many of them work very hard to get to know the country where they are working, and they have a good knowledge of what works and what doesn't work, at least in the short term. But there are several constraints that make their job very difficult. They often have to show short-term results, even though everyone knows that democratization and peace building are very long processes. So this is, of course, a big challenge. And in some places, it's even a struggle for them to just stay alive, to arrange for safety, electricity, food, and water. So in many places, I think we should be surprised that anything can be achieved. We need to have more realistic expectations of what international peace missions can accomplish. But I think the most fundamental constraint for international peace building is that international peace operations are not local. And democratization and peace building are local processes. And both internationals and locals working with internationals, they always run the risk of being seen as foreigners or outsider, alien to the local culture. And I think one thing that could be improved in the practice is that we need to investigate better what local people expect from peace and democracy. And we also need to investigate better what processes of peace building and democratization exist before beginning international peace operation. I think we have a very narrow view of what democratization entails. I think we should open up a bit and look at local processes and perhaps see reforms within traditional forms of government, perhaps see reforms within chieftaincy systems. That could be part of a process of democratization. Sometimes elections are introduced to chieftaincy systems as a way of gaining greater legitimacy also. So I think we need to more carefully look at what is going on locally. What are the local initiatives? What else can we do? Well, what is the role for research in this? Well, I think here is perhaps one of the main fault lines in current academic and policy discourses on peace building. I feel that as researchers we have an obligation to try to think about the policy implications of our research. And we should try to be as clear as we can, and also be clear on what the limits of research is and when we cannot provide policy advice. Because otherwise it's partly our fault when research is misrepresented by policymakers or when it's used to justify military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think that we need to think hard about how the practice of international peace building can be improved. There are other researchers who say that, well, international peace building rests on the wrong assumption and should be rejected. The democratic peace thesis or liberal peace thesis is wrong, and therefore it will just need to lead to colonialism or neocolonialism, and it will never end well. So we should just reject all forms of international peace building missions. But I don't think that peace building will disappear. So I don't think that is a very constructive approach. I find it very problematic that some critical studies only deconstruct and criticize peace building and don't discuss alternatives or ways forward, which could be more useful for policymakers. But I do appreciate critical studies of peace building that explore alternatives within international peace building, or how they can exist in parallel, and I think that Roger McGinty will talk more about this because this is something that he knows much better than I do. But he shows, for instance, that even when attempts are made to create local ownership, local practices and initiatives are often co-opted by international missions. So this helps us to understand more about the relationship between local and international peace building, and why it is so difficult to achieve local ownership. It is hard to draw policy conclusions from much research that is produced. Well, take power sharing, for instance. That's an issue that I've been working on a lot. One example, just the elections in Bosnia-Herzegovina led to a government consisting of actors that instigated the war, and the same political parties still remain in power. The lesson learned approach would then be not to hold too early elections, but to give adequate time for peace building before the first post-conflict election. However, I don't think that is, well, there's no clear evidence on how such a period should be designed to initiate a process of democratization and build lasting peace. Should, for instance, well, the one obstacle is, well, who should govern in the meantime? Should the international community step in to run the community, like in Kosovo, Bosnia? Well, in Kosovo, where there was an international protectorate, well, this is a very costly operation, and I don't think it will be repeated, and it would definitely not be possible to finance in larger countries, such as Syria, when that conflict eventually will end. So I don't think that is really a solution. But an alternative to early elections is to have a period of power sharing. And power sharing is almost the opposite of an election in essence, because while democracy, or the opposite of democracy, because while democracy builds on the notion of free competition and uncertain electoral outcomes, power sharing reduces the uncertainty by ensuring political power for certain groups. So such governments of unity is often formed after a civil war. In fact, a majority of peace agreements include provisions for power sharing. But how does this type of transitional arrangement affect the subsequent processes of democratization? Well, power sharing agreements often consist of the former enemies of war, and they are expected to work together in a joint government. The risk of stalemate or continuation of the war, but with political means, is obvious. But I think that sometimes the alternatives to power sharing are in practice often worse. At the same time, there is no evidence that power sharing really provides for peace. About half of the peace agreements providing for political power sharing were followed by armed conflict, while the other half were followed by a period of absence of armed conflict. So what conclusions can we draw from that? I believe that power sharing should be avoided when it is possible. But sometimes the promise of power sharing is the price you have to pay to get the warring parties to the negotiation table. I believe that power sharing in that way has contributed to ending some wars, in some cases. But it cannot be translated into general policy recommendations for all conflict countries. In addition, we know very little about the long-term consequences of power sharing for peace and democratization. It is often believed that power sharing can be a hindrance to democratization, and that it's difficult to move away from such arrangements. And that is certainly true. But at the same time, we also know that there are cases where power sharing has been implemented, elections have been held, and peace has been maintained, at least the first year after the election. There are cases such as Burundi, Comoros, the DRC, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Mali, Mexico, Colombia, Bangladesh, Tajikistan, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. So it means that there's no evidence that we should remove power sharing from the toolbox of peace builders. Sometimes power sharing can be very useful. A problem, as I said, is that we don't really know about the long-term consequences of peace building. One reason for that is that it's only now that we really have old cases that we can assess. Now we have, like in Cambodia and Mozambique and Bosnia, these countries, they share the experience of an international peacebuilding mission, including a military component, and they have also enjoyed the absence of war during at least 20 years. But if we look at them, I mean, I agree that there is a template or the international peace operation often include the same similar components. But when we look at the pathways that different countries take, or how it develops in different countries, I think the pathways to peace differ a great deal from each other. So even though peace operations often include very similar components, the local context differs. The local society can resist and reshape international interventions. And this means that international peace building often has unintended consequences. And that is not necessarily bad. Sometimes it undermines processes towards democracy and peace. But in other cases, something new and more sustainable develops. I think we need to know more about this and learn more about these old cases. Another problem is, of course, that the practice of peace building has developed, and now there's more focus on state building, and there are perhaps more realistic expectations. We don't expect democracy to be to emerge so quickly. But that means that since the practice of peace building and the mandates are changing, it's really difficult to know, even if we assess and evaluate and analyze these old cases. We don't really know what will happen with these more recent cases. So we don't really know, are we doing the right and the wrong thing? Because there will be a few steps forward and then several steps back, and then it will go back and forth. So we don't really know in the long run what works and what doesn't work. We just know what happens in the short term. And it is, of course, in a way, plausible at least, that there is some sort of path dependency. If you start out with only warring actors in government, it can't be a very good start for democracy. But perhaps it is possible to achieve democracy in the long run, even if you have such a bad start. Well, so to conclude, I think I also talked a bit longer here, but I think, yeah, we have to recognize that peace building takes time. It takes decades or even generations to overcome the traumas of civil war when neighbors and family members have been killing each other. It really takes time. And we must have realistic expectations of what peace building can achieve. We also have to be more ambitious in learning what is going on locally. What are the local processes of democracy and peace building? And what do people expect from peace and democracy? I think when we talk about what is a success and what is a failure, we have to ask people what do they expect. And sometimes people are more interested in food and jobs, perhaps, than democracy. But that is something that we have to accept and we have to work with. And apart from that, we cannot impose our ideas. I think also we have finally difficult task ahead of us to be better at trying to bridging the gap between academia and policy. I will end there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. I really appreciate that. There was a lot of interesting material there. I mean, talking about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that some of these principles of liberal peace building and democracy are in fact universal principles. The idea, I think, very interesting about trade-offs when we are implementing or when donors are implementing peace building programs, trade-offs, security and or democracy and so on. So this is also, I think, very important. And your broader point about being more realistic and recognizing that the time factor, that this is a very long-term, perhaps a generational process. So I think all of these things are things that we have to keep in mind, and perhaps we can touch on some of these during the question period. I see there's a lot of activity in the chat box. That's great, and we'll definitely pose those questions and comments to our presenters during the question period. So I will now pass the floor to Roger, who will give his remarks. Thanks, Roger.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Mark for saving the airfare and allowing me to join you from Manchester. This software really is destroying the one academic luxury, which is travel. And hello to Anna and Paul as well. Now, the question is peacebuilding dying? And Paul had a really lovely line in his remarks, and that was, if it's dying, it's taking a hell of a long time to die. And that got me thinking, because if we think about peacebuilding, and I realize that peacebuilding is a plurality, we have to think of peace buildings. But if we do think about peacebuilding, then in terms of life and death, I would suggest that it's in a medically induced coma. I would suggest that for structural reasons, international organizations and leading states are quite content for limited forms of peacebuilding to operate. But those forms of peacebuilding operate in deference to state sovereignty, to security, to stabilization. Now, so you can probably tell that my remarks are going to be quite critical. But before I launch into a critical rant, I think we do have to recognize that peacebuilding has saved and improved many lives, that many people have taken risks, that much of peacebuilding is under-celebrated or uncelebrated, just as much of the humanitarian and development activity is under-celebrated and uncelebrated. So I think we should recognize and salute the positive and the good. Now, let's look for evidence of life in peacebuilding. Imagine the patient laid out in front of us. We're going to check for vital signs, for a pulse. And we can find evidence of life. We can find it in terms of the rhetoric of peacebuilding. The term is becoming a little unfashionable now, but it certainly exploded onto the scene post-1992 and the Agenda for Peace document. We could see the broadening of UN mandates, many more INGOs. We could see a shift towards more social aspects of peace and peacemaking. So issues of identity, issues of social inclusion became involved or became present in peace accords. They weren't just about securing a border. They weren't just about dealing with SSR and DDR. They were interested in issues of reconciliation, of social inclusion, of many other social issues, so-called softer issues. And so we've seen a lot of policy innovation. We've seen human security, responsibility to protect. I personally am very critical of both ideas. I think they promised much but have delivered little. But at the same time, I think it's significant that they have made their way onto the policy agenda and have said to the policy community, there is more going on here than simply security. And then if we look for evidence of life within the academic community, we can see there are many journals, many workshops, this eSeminar. We have the superlative journal that I edit, which is called Peacebuilding. So we've seen much academic debate on this concept and related concepts. I do think, though, that we have to be realistic about this academic work. We have to realize that it tends to come from white folks from the global north, that it tends to be quite limited because of that, and it is shaped by a political economy, which means that it is often academic and think tank institutions in the global north that are able to set the agenda. So there is some evidence that the patient is alive. But I don't think we can proceed with this question unless we do a power analysis, unless we ask, within peacebuilding programs and projects, where does power lie? And if we look at societies that have undergone civil war and then have been subject to massive peacebuilding intervention, then we can see often that elites are still in power. Look at somewhere like Lebanon, where there are elite families that stay in power generation after generation. It doesn't matter about a civil war. It doesn't matter about peace building. The same old folks are still in the big houses. If we look at the gender balance of societies that have undergone civil war and peace building, often we don't see significant change. If we look at property rights and the distribution of property, again, often we don't see significant change. Often we see a decline in electoral participation. So whether it's Mozambique, El Salvador, Kosovo, Northern Ireland, the first election after a peace agreement has very high rates of electoral participation, and often there's a very steep decline when people realize it doesn't really matter whether I vote or not. My life isn't going to change. And if we look at the international system in an era of peace building, can we really say there has been significant change? It is still dominated by the same powers. It is still dominated by the same international organizations. Those international organizations have been captured by an elite few states which refuse to reform them. Isn't it bizarre that the UN Security Council reflects the world in 1945 rather than 2015? We see an emphasis by some states and international organizations on the state and a very traditional notion of sovereignty, and we see quite a lot of emphasis on the status quo, on stability. So the picture seems very mixed. And whilst peace building is still alive, it is shaped by power. And that power forces it towards state building and stabilization rather than more progressive notions, more emancipatory notions of reconciliation, of conciliation, of communities working out new forms of coexistence and maybe something more promising and progressive than coexistence, like conflict transformation. So the picture is very mixed, and I'm not in any way a quantitative scholar, but I've been doing some work with quantitative scholars, and they've been looking at peace accords, comprehensive peace accords that have been reached over the past 20 years. 34 comprehensive peace accords have been reached between 1989 and 2013. There's a really interesting pattern from those peace accords, and that is the majority of provisions in the peace accords relate to security issues rather than social issues. So 59% of accords in comprehensive peace accords, or provisions in comprehensive peace accords, relate to security issues. 27% relate to social issues, such as the inclusion of minorities, the recognition of minority languages. In a sense, the emphasis in terms of the construction of peace accords still is about ministering to men with guns rather than the families that were shouting, the families that weren't firing guns. Now, because something is in a peace accord, it doesn't really tell us very much. So let's look at the implementation of different provisions in peace accords. And we see again the emphasis on security peace building rather than social peace building. So 72% of provisions relating to security have either been partially or fully implemented. It drops to 60%, 60, when we talk about social issues. And if we look at a timeline, we can see a gradual, but a very gradual shift towards social issues. So this glass is half full and half empty. It's difficult to come to a definitive judgment. Now, peace building, or the patient, is going through very tough times. I could carry the analogy of the patient further, but I'll just stick with peace building. There are a number of problems. First of all, there is a crisis of access. Look at the countries in which there are very severe conflicts. Syria, Ukraine, Iraq, Israel, Libya. The international community cannot get into those countries in the ways it would like. The states that have appointed themselves as the leaders of the international community also have suffered an information failure, an intelligence failure. So it's very difficult to engage in peace building if we don't know what's going on the ground. Another problem that confronts peace building is the normalization of violence from Western states. For example, Western governments have been bombing ISIS in Iraq for the past number of months. There was no serious policy discussion in the UK or the United States about alternatives. Bombing from the air has become the default position. It's not newsworthy anymore. we don't actually know what our bombs are doing. Our militaries don't seem to be under democratic pressure to report to us what they're actually doing. So the use of violence by so-called peace-building states has become normalized, and that's problematic. Another problem is that there is very little appetite for conflict transformation. There's little appetite to go beyond solving the immediate problem. There's little appetite to go beyond solving difficult problems like relationships and reconciliation. That's because it costs money. And as Anna said previously, peace building takes a very long time. And we know that project and program cycles are linked to budgets. They think in terms of 6 months or 1 year or just a few years. They think in terms of quick impact. And we can think of very good reasons why governments want to save money rather than spend it on other populations. So peacebuilding suffers from a number of problems with the world that it lives in, that it has to work around. There is the problem that states cannot think beyond the state. There is the problem that neoliberalism is the default option in terms of state building and the re-engineering of economies. But I don't want to finish my remarks by being bleak, by being pessimistic, because I think if we can conceptualize peace building as something that happens also beyond programs and projects, beyond civil society organizations, beyond NGOs and INGOs, then we can think more positively. We can look for everyday peace building, everyday civility that happens within communities, in city neighborhoods, in valleys, in workplaces, in public sector places of employment. And I think that one of the problems that we have within certainly the academic world, but I think also in the policy world, is that we have difficulty seeing this under the radar peace building, this everyday civility and toleration. It's very low key. It doesn't use the language and terminology that practitioners use or that academics use, but it's there. And I think that part of the problem is that we focus too much on civil society organizations, on formal peace building, rather than the informal. And I think the informal has a very good story to tell. The problem, though, is ours. We, and I mean we in the global north, are actually poorly equipped to see this everyday peace building. So let me finish my remarks there, and with everyone else, I'll be really happy to join in with the discussion.
Well, thanks very much, Roger. Thought-provoking as usual. I really appreciate those remarks. I think that ended us off very well for the presentations. I mean, I particularly took note of your discussion of the securitization in many ways of peace building and how it's been instrumentalized in some ways by donors and different agencies to achieve particular ends. And you ended off by talking about some of those alternatives. And so I think that's something that's certainly come up in the chat. So I think we're going to begin our overall discussion. So we'll put everyone up on the screen now, so you'll see all four of us. I am going to moderate this discussion. We have only 15 minutes left, so we'll see if we can get through as much as possible, because there's a lot of really interesting comments out there. What I would say to the audience is please continue to put comments and questions. We might not get to all of them, but we will record all of these and we will factor them into certainly our report, particularly your comments. So, and I'd also say to our audiences, don't leave right away at the end. We also have a poll for you to answer about how you enjoyed and what you got out of this presentation. So when it ends off, don't immediately turn off your screen. Wait to find that link for our poll. So let me launch straight into some of the questions, of which we have a lot of. First of all, my good friend Jonathan Sandy, who's done excellent work in Sierra Leone and in Somalia, has talked about the fact that in those environments, there has been efforts to engage informal and traditional security, justice, governance structures quite successfully. Roger, Paul have written a lot about the idea of hybridity. This, of course, is also a controversial topic today. But I wonder if all three of you could give your thoughts on this issue of engaging the non-state, engaging local informal actors, because there, of course, is a lot of pushback on that idea that many of the practices of these informal actors might violate Western norms, and for that matter, internationally accepted human rights norms and so on. But on the other hand, are seen by many local actors as highly legitimate. So I was wondering, your thoughts on this. So maybe since Roger spoke last, maybe I'll start with Roger and then I'll go around to everybody. So Roger, go ahead.
I think it's useful when thinking about other societies to take a good look at ourselves and to think about our own positionality and to think about the ethical, moral, and political framework that we are in. Because who are we to tell or advise or enforce or police someone else's society? Of course, they're going to have cultural mores, political mores that will be different from ours and possibly offensive to us. But surely we also have to be aware that we can be very offensive, that our cultures are very funny and very odd. So I think it's useful, rather than to think about those societies over there being a problem because of their attitude towards patriarchy or human rights, to actually look at us and not necessarily see it as their problem, but as our problem. So that would be my combative response.
Yes, I'm thinking about, engaging the non-state. I'm thinking about, in some of these old cases, which have experienced now 20 years of non-war, for instance, in Bosnia, now it has taken a very long time, you could say, from the end of the war. But now we see some multi-ethnic mobilization or some cooperation taking place informally outside of the state, within very different for us. And there are demonstrations and protests against the establishment, against the elite, against the political parties, against the former warring groups, and people demand more democracy and another type of society. And I think, this is also taking place in places like South Africa, that it's, I think that we should see, as I say, peace building as a very long-term process. And perhaps now, 20 years after a peace agreement has been signed and some of the old war heroes have died, now finally there is more space for like normal people to engage. And also some of the worst wounds have healed, so it's possible to join hands in some ways. And that I think are very positive signs. For a long time, Bosnia was a frozen conflict, but now I think there are signs that perhaps something very important is happening. There's a way forward. So definitely we have to look at engaging with the non-state, and I don't know how much the internationals should interfere, but I think it's a positive sign. I also think, I mean, if you look at Somaliland, for instance, there you can also see, and there you have the absence of international intervention. But at the same time, I don't know really how useful that would be as a policy-wise to stay out of there. And I think that, yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, great, Paul. Briefly.
Yeah, I'm just pondering on the question of normal people. I'd quite like to meet some normal people sometime. That would be good. I think I tried to make this point at the end of when I spoke, but maybe I didn't make it very clearly. That I think Roger raises a really important point here. That it's important to get away from labeling the non-state as just being good or bad. And I think that, you know, when I work in Sierra Leone, I've worked in Sierra Leone on and off for years. I have lots of Sierra Leonean friends, but I'm British. I come home and I live in the UK, and it's up to them to live in their society. I think though that there are a number of questions that donors and international agencies and those who are motivated to create longer term peace face, and they are really to do with the idea that some of those traditional systems, even though you may be able to question how traditional they actually are in some places, some of those traditional systems traditionally are biased against some groups. And they're not always nice, cozy, individual community societies. And at the same time, you could argue that the state isn't, particularly functioning either. So it's a kind of choice between the lesser of two evils. My own personal view is that it's not necessarily a question of interfering. It's a question, if you're really going to go very bottom up again about this, and justice is a good example of this, that actually you go right down to individuals, and what you do is you help them make choices that will best benefit them. So if they want to go into the traditional system, they can go into the traditional system. If they want to go into a formal system, if there is one, they can go into a formal system of justice. But if you're really going to go bottom up, then actually you don't just go in and replace one system with an entirely other system and say, you've now got to use that one. You have to actually empower them. And empowering them means you have to leave them some degree of choice between the different systems that face them.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. I really appreciate that. We had a question talking about the linkages between peace building and state building. Very often they're spoke of almost synonymously, which kind of, I think, almost gives peace building an air that it's a technical process, as opposed to more of an art form and dealing with some of also the soft aspects of it. And that question was really posed by Dr. I apologize if I get the pronunciation wrong. Nwokolo. Okay, thank you. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that connection. What is that? What is that meant for the implementation of peace building in recent years and going forward? So maybe I'll start with Anna here, and then we'll go to Paul and then Roger. Go ahead.
I was still thinking about. Please repeat the question.
No, I was talking about the linkages. We often talk about state building and peace building, and we refer to them almost synonymously as if they're one thing. In fact, they involve very different processes, very different principles in some ways undergird those. So what do you think, one of our questioners asked, going forward, what do you think that means for the future of peace building?
Well, yeah, I don't think I really have I have to think about that.
A minute. All right, Paul, go ahead.
You can start with me because I know Endabrisi. So hello, Endabrisi. Yeah, I mean, this is actually quite a difficult question to answer with a short answer. My view, I think, is that they are not the same thing, although they are inextricably entwined. And I think that you're right, Mark, in that I think that they've become much more closely associated. And I think a lot of international interventions assume that they're the same thing. Certainly there are assumptions, you create security and then everything else will kind of follow, including peace. And you get a peace agreement and then you have a functioning, you have a kind of a functioning democracy or some kind of party system, and then everything's okay and we now have peace. But I liked, Anna uses a phrase in her book that I use all of the time, and in fact is in one of my slides that I teach with. I wrote it down. So settlements do not end conflicts. They're simply agreements to continue bargaining under consensually defined rules of interaction. That's one of my favorite sentences that I use when we talk about peace agreements. Because actually, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily peaceful. You can actually have sort of defined rules of interaction that could lead to all kinds of things. And I think certainly in the work I've been doing in Nepal recently, what we're looking at is the nature of post-conflict violence and how that has changed from the during conflict to post-conflict. And what we see is a massive rise in homicides and a massive rise in domestic violence and a reduction in state-sponsored violence. And actually part of that is to do with the process of peace building, which is connected with processes within the communities and social development and economic development that puts a different set of pressure on people as one kind of society changes. And any kind of societal change involves conflict at one level or another. The trick is to make it non-violent conflict rather than violent conflict. I think if you're really looking at state building and peace building and you want a short answer, they are different things, but they are, if you think of them as like being like a Venn diagram, so they overlap quite considerably. I think that's probably the safest way to think about it. Sorry, that was quite a garbled answer to that. I didn't mean it to be quite so garbled.
That's okay. Roger.
I would agree very much with what Paul said. I like the notion of the Venn diagram. I think, though, that one of the circles is bigger or is encroaching on one of the other circles in this Venn diagram. Because I think that state building has supplanted peace building. There are a number of reasons for this, quite structural, but part of it is because it's easier. State building is the low-hanging fruit of peace building.
Yeah.
It can engage in path-dependent, technocratic, measurable exercises, training civil servants, restructuring ministries, that sort of thing. Whereas the softer, so-called softer, more sociological aspects of peace, such as reconciliation, such as working out modalities of local governance, are actually very difficult to do in a short time period, in the guise of a quick impact project. I think fundamentally, though, the dominance of state building over peace building reflects a lack of imagination on the part of states, international organizations, and, dare I say it, academics, in thinking beyond the state. We know that states don't work in many cases. We know that they work in some cases, quite a lot of cases, but they simply don't work in other cases. And what do? We try to rebuild the state constantly, even though it doesn't work. And again, that comes back to us. And I think we need to think quite carefully about why we have this fixation with the state and why we try to build and rebuild the state, even though it comes in very many forms. We've been unable to escape the box that is the state. We're trapped in it.
Okay, great. I have one more question because we're just almost out of time. And the question really, I think, builds on one of Anna's remarks, but also Roger dealt with this in his presentation as well, which is what should the role of research be in peacebuilding, in the peacebuilding field going forward, looking ahead. So Anna referred to it. Roger, you spoke about the fact that really this is a northern perspective of research, that northern researchers, academics are setting the agenda. You know, are there other examples of bringing in the South, bringing in other voices? One of our participants, Yelena, from the Department of Foreign Affairs in Canada, asked a very good question. She said, are there peacebuilding materials out there that are written in other languages? Because, and many of our other participants said that there is a need for this, and why isn't it happening? So I was wondering, just to end off this lecture, and I apologize to all of our participants who I couldn't get to their questions, but if we could end off by saying, well, where should research be going? And do you know of any innovative examples that could really provide a positive example going forward, something to emulate? So maybe I'm going to go
Yes,
back
well,
to
I'm still thinking about the last question, but this is also for future research, I guess. That I think that when I talk about peace building nowadays, I think about Galton's triangle, the ABC, attitude, changing attitudes, behavior, and addressing conflict issues. And peace building, a lot of the missions, the peace building practice is one thing, and that focuses on the behavior, how to stop violence. And I think another thing is why it has been so much focus now on state building is that it's easier to do, and that can also, but it is important because that addresses a common conflict issue. That the conflict, the origins of conflict, often has to do with power and government, who should be in control, and territory, and that are like state properties. But I think what has been neglected is the attitude, the attitude part. So the ABC, we have forgotten about the attitudes, and that is reconciliation. And here I don't really think, I cannot see really well, here it's really must be a local project. How could the international deal with this? But it has been forgotten. So I think that this is something that we as researchers should bring in and also explore more on how this is done locally. And this is the way forward, I think, for peace building.
Yeah.
Yes.
So looking at the local, yeah. Okay, Roger, I'll go to you next.
Let me concentrate on the what's the role of research, and I'll be very quick. I think it should be humble. It should begin from a position that we're not the experts on someone else's society. I think it should be subversive. It should not be about reinventing and simply doing what governments tell us to do. It should be innovative, and hopefully it should be participative. And there are quite a number of initiatives out there that are trying to move away from the model in which white folks from the global north have all of the power in the research dynamic, and they merely see other people in conflict-affected societies as being data or as being enumerators. So I can explicate at great length on alternative types of research projects, but something tells me that time is up. But I think humility is the crucial thing that we're lacking in research agendas at the moment.
Yeah, great. Paul, you have the last word.
Okay, I'll be very quick. I agree with Anna in her emphasis on the local, but then again, I would, having spent a lot of time out in the sort of local areas. I also agree with Roger in terms of being humble. I think maybe I think I'll say something, a warning, and then something positive. My warning is that actually, I agree very much with Roger that we shouldn't be trying too hard to be useful to people who are currently policymakers, because we need to be very careful about who defines what is useful, because that in itself is a power relationship, and we as academics who do projects and seek money to do projects and all that kind of stuff, we need to be very careful about that. So I'm very much of the school that thinks that actually we should do research, and then if there are policy implications that come out of it, then that's good. But we shouldn't be seeking to just back up and do things that are of interest to policymakers. That shouldn't be our starting point. I think, so I do stuff that's interesting to me and then turn it into policy, if you see what I mean. I think the second point is that there are a lot of good researchers out there, and there is some very good research. It's interesting, I gave a seminar last week at a methodology workshop for PhD students, where it's my role to talk about working in difficult environments, so-called difficult environments. And I made exactly the same point that Roger just made about don't treat people as data, treat them as people. And actually, the main concern of most of the grad students was that they were worried that making friends with people who they lived with over a period of months in the field would affect the objectivity of their research, which I actually thought was a really strange way of thinking about it. And I think in some ways academia has become removed from humanity in some ways. And I think we need to remember that we're humans too, and that actually, for someone like me, I'm a social scientist because I like people. I find people interesting, not data particularly.
Okay, great. Well, I think this has been a great start to this series. Really excellent. I thought this was both enjoyable and a very useful discussion. As I said, this is just the beginning. We're going to be doing 4 to 5 of these events on looking at peace building and state building for the next 3 years. So I hope you all tune in, and we'll be talking about these types of challenges, so every few months. I should note that all of the videos of the individual speakers, as well as the discussion period, will be posted on our website, so please feel free to access those and tell others that they can access them here. We will produce a short report which we think highlights some of the important items that were addressed here and some of the takeaway points, and we'll also be integrating some of the excellent comments that came in the chat forum. So all of the material that we had here will be used. So thanks to everyone who contributed, as well as our esteemed speakers. So I think now, just before we end off, I will say that our next event will happen in the spring, so keep an eye out for the notice about what the topic will be and the date that it'll be held. If you have any ideas of topics that you would like us to address, please let us know. We're open to that. We've had some discussions about that internally, but we're open. I'd like to thank our funder, the IDRC here in Canada, as well as our institutional partners, the Balsillie School of International Affairs, as well as Laurier University. So thank you to all. And now my colleague Jeff will put a link up on the screen, which will show you where you can fill out a survey to tell us how you like this format and whether there's anything we can do to improve it in the future, as well as there's some space to make some suggestions, including topic suggestions. So thanks again. Thanks to my speakers. Most importantly, you guys were fantastic. And, I thought this was just it exceeded my expectations for the first event. So thanks so much for taking part.
Thanks.
No problem. Cheers, Mark.
All right. So with that, I'll sign off.
Bye, everyone.
We'll all be in touch. All right. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.